The warrior is one of the most iconic classes in Classic WoW. Like the mage, it's a class you'll recognise from almost every RPG or MMO. It also comes with a very clear reputation. People describe it as punishing to level and heavily dependent on gear. At the same time, it's known for becoming extremely strong at max level. That is often the reason so many players choose warrior in the first place. But before any of that matters, every warrior has to get through the early leveling experience. That's what this video focuses on. What early warrior leveling actually looks like, before gear, weapons, stats and abilities offer more room to recover from mistakes. This video is part of an early leveling experience series I'm putting together for each class in Classic WoW. You'll find the other videos in the playlist. At this point in Classic WoW, it's widely understood that starting a warrior means accepting a slower leveling pace and limited room forever. Most players expect damage output to be inconsistent and mistakes to be punished harshly. But because of that, early warrior advice tends to focus on caution. Thoughtful pulls, proper positioning and avoiding multiple mobs are commonly recommended as ways to manage the difficulty. Other advice often follows the same pattern. Players are encouraged to only fight green mobs and avoid yellow or orange quests in order to reduce risk. The underlying expectation is that if you play carefully and make the right decisions, most early fights will be manageable. That expectation is partly correct, however, it does not fully reflect how early warrior leveling actually plays out. Early warrior leveling is defined by inconsistency. Damage output is unreliable. Fights often begin with very little progress, followed by sudden spikes of damage later on. This makes combat feel uneven and difficult to predict. Warriors have a baseline chance to miss with their attacks, which is noticeable early on. Misses, along with enemy dodges and parries, occur frequently enough to affect the outcome of normal pulls. Rage generation adds to this instability. Rage is only generated by dealing or taking damage, and it is not available at the start of most fights. As a result, early pulls often begin without access to key abilities. When attacks miss early, rage generation is delayed. This can lead to situations where the warrior is losing health without having the resources needed to respond. Because of this, fights often take longer than expected. Enemy health decreases slowly at first, while the warrior's health can drop quickly if early attacks fail to connect. If the opening moments go poorly, regaining control later in the fight becomes much more difficult. This is why recommendations such as only fighting green mobs are common. They reduce risk, but they do not change how early warrior combat functions. Even against lower level enemies, early warrior leveling is still shaped by inconsistent damage, delayed rage generation, and limited access to abilities. Rage is only generated by dealing or taking damage. It is not generated by abilities that replace a normal weapon swing such as Heroic Strike. Rage also decays when out of combat, at roughly 1 rage per second. As a result, unless rage is carried over from a previous fight, most pulls begin with very little rage available. This has a direct impact on early combat. Key abilities are often unavailable at the start of a fight when they would be most useful. If a pull begins poorly, there may not be enough rage to apply Hamstring to disengage, use Sunder Armour to gain threat in a group scenario, use Heroic Strike to end a fight quickly. Without rage, these tools may as well not exist. If attacks miss early and rage generation is delayed, health can drop before any meaningful response is possible. The important point is that warrior cannot respond to danger instantly. The class requires the fight to progress before the tools become available. This creates a tension in early leveling. Advice often recommends slow, careful pulls, but slow pulls also means starting each fight with no rage. The result is a class that struggles to react to mistakes unless conditions are favourable or momentum already exists. Downtime is a defining part of early warrior leveling. Because early fights often end with low health, recovery is required after most pulls. This usually means stopping to eat or bandage before the next fight can begin. Health recovery at low levels is slow. Food restores health gradually, and the amount recovered is limited by what food you have available at your level. As a result, even successful pulls often lead to extended pauses between fights. This limits how safely a warrior can chain pulls together. Starting a fight without full health increases risk significantly, especially if early attacks miss or rage generation is delayed. Mistakes or RNG increase the frequency of downtime sharply. If the opening attack misses, if an extra mob joins the fight, or if a pull takes longer than expected, you often end the fight at low health. Providing you have the resources, recovery usually takes the form of eating or using a bandage. On its own, this may only take a maximum of 30 seconds. The impact comes from how often these pauses occur. Frequent short recoveries break momentum and slow overall progress, even when no single mistake is severe. In response, players may be tempted to push pulls earlier or take additional risks, which often leads to low health finishes and further recovery. Early warrior leveling is therefore not just about surviving fights, It's about managing the time cost of recovery after each one. Progress is slowed not only by deaths, but by how often the warrior is forced to stop and reset before continuing. Early warrior levelling is highly dependent on gear, and more than any other slot, weapon quality has the largest impact. A warrior's damage comes primarily from auto attacks. Rage generation is tied to dealing damage, which means higher weapon damage results in more rage gain per hit. When weapon damage is low, fights take longer. Longer fights means slower rage generation, fewer ability uses, and more time spent taking incoming damage. This creates a direct chain of effects. A weaker weapon leads to less rage, fewer available abilities, and reduced control over the fight. Even when pulls are clean, poor weapon damage can turn otherwise manageable encounters into drawn-out fights. Because of this, skill alone has limited impact early on. Good decision making can reduce risk, but it cannot compensate for a weapon that significantly underperforms for the level. Weapon upgrades therefore have an outsized effect on early warrior levelling, not by changing how the class plays, but by reducing how long each fight lasts and how punishing mistakes become. There are several mistakes that commonly appear during early warrior levelling, especially for new or returning players. One of the most common is pulling multiple mobs. In starting zones, this often goes unpunished, as enemies deal relatively low damage. Once players move into later early zones, the same behaviour becomes much more dangerous, and fights can collapse quickly. Another mistake is overestimating how much protection armour provides. Although warriors wear mail gear until level 40, early mail values offer limited damage mitigation. Armour reduces incoming damage slightly, but it does not compensate for long fights or poor pull outcomes. Continuing to pull while already low on health is another frequent issue. This becomes significantly riskier when rage is also low, as there may be no ability access at the start of the next fight. Failing to disengage early enough is also common. If a fight has already gone poorly, waiting too long to retreat often removes any remaining chance to escape, especially without enough rage to apply hamstring. Another issue that often catches players out appears once you move beyond the starting zones. Many enemies begin to flee at low health. When this happens, fights can extend beyond the area they were intended to be contained in. Even with careful pulls, a fleeing mob can run into a nearby enemy or a patrol, turning a single pull into an unexpected multi-mob situation. Finally, many players assume rage will be available when they need it. In early levelling, rage availability is inconsistent, and expecting it to appear at the right moment can lead to situations where no response is possible. These mistakes are not the result of poor play, they are normal outcomes of how early warrior mechanics interact with combat pacing and recovery. Early warrior levelling teaches discipline through consequence. Pull decisions matter more than execution. Choosing when and where to engage often has a larger impact than what happens during the fight itself. The class also enforces patience. Fights take time, recovery is frequent, and attempting to rush progress usually increases risk. Positioning before combat becomes important very early on. Because dealing with multiple mobs early is dangerous, early warrior levelling reinforces the importance of careful pulling. Early warrior levelling also teaches respect for enemy damage. Normal mobs can hit relatively hard, and small mistakes are punished quickly, even in otherwise routine encounters. Progress is slower by design, downtime is part of the experience, and trying to remove it often leads to worse outcomes rather than faster levelling. Finally, the class teaches the limits of control. Good decisions reduce risk, but they do not guarantee safe outcomes. Random elements and delayed access to abilities still shape how fights end. These lessons are not taught explicitly, they are reinforced repeatedly through how early warrior combat behaves. These lessons don't disappear later on, but how harshly they are enforced does change as the class develops. After level 10, the warrior experience begins to stabilise, primarily through improved rage control. Talents such as anger management, unbridled wrath, and improved blood rage become available as the talent system opens up, and directly affect how rage behaves. They increase rage generation and reduce how quickly rage decays out of combat, which is significant when moving from one mob to the next. Because rage is more likely to be carried between pulls, encounters are less likely to start with no resources available. This reduces the number of fights where the warrior is forced to wait for early auto attacks before being able to act. The toolkit also begins to fill out. Abilities such as Blood Rage, Revenge, and Sweeping Strikes, combined with Cleave, allow the warrior to make more effective use of the rage they have, rather than simply reacting once it is generated. This changes encounters. Mistakes are still punished, but they're less likely to result in death. As gear and damage improve, fights end more quickly and with less health lost, reducing the amount of recovery time needed between pulls. Core lessons from early levelling still apply. Positioning, pull discipline, and respect for enemy damage remain important, but the class is no longer operating with such a narrow margin for error. The experience becomes less volatile, but the underlying demands remain. The warrior is widely known as one of the slowest and most punishing classes in Classic WoW. That reputation is accurate. What stands out though is that early warrior leveling demands constant engagement. Even at low levels, there are very few situations where you can move through content without paying attention. Every pull carries weight and mistakes are rarely ignored. It had been a long time since I last leveled a warrior, so I revisited the early experience specifically for this video. And despite dying multiple times, and despite making many of the mistakes discussed here, it was still an enjoyable process. Playing a class that consistently sits close to failure makes the leveling experience feel deliberate and involved. For me, that tension is what makes things interesting. I'd be interested to hear about your own experiences leveling a warrior. Did your experience match what's been discussed here, or did you find the early levels more forgiving? Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.